Welcome back to The Shed. Today I would like to take a look at the 1971 Nebula Award winning novel by one of my all-time favourite authors in Robert Silverberg's A Time of Changes. So what I would like to do is provide a bit of a plot overview, talk to what I liked, what I didn't like. I'll put it to the memory test, I'll make some recommendations, and then we'll rank it on our ever-growing sci-fi shed ladder where I've been ranking all the Hugo and Nebula Award winning novels. So Kinal Darivul is the prince of this province of Sala, and his brother has just been promoted to the Septarch, this supreme ruler of that kingdom, because his father has just come to an unfortunate end due to a bird that looks something like the skeletal remains on the cover there, which I thought was a pretty interesting way to go. So his brother has become the ruler of this province, and Kinal has gone on this self-inflicted exile because he doesn't want to have conflict with his brother, and he thought the best way to prevent that is to just exile myself and get myself as far away as I can from my brother, so there's no sort of temptation for him to come after me, because I really don't want any part of that. This lends him to going through some pretty interesting journeys, which eventually has him laying in a place in a province called, what was it, Mandarin. And he takes on a pretty influential bureaucratic position there, and he becomes rather wealthy and influential and powerful person in the realms of Mandarin. What we learn during his travels before he gets to Mandarin is that this world that Robert Silverberg has painted here has a very interesting and strict religious background. They follow this covenant, and this covenant basically means that one of the key aspects of this religion, this covenant, is that all reference to self is seen as an aberration, is seen as something very vile that you just do not do. So much so that anyone who refers to themselves as I or me conversationally is frowned upon, and anyone who bears their soul and actually would go to someone and say, oh, I love you, and really get that connection going, will be referred to as a self-bearer, and these people are imprisoned and sent to jail, and sometimes even far further than that. So it's a rather interesting covenant sort of religious theme that's going on in this novel. So we find that Kinal is in Mandarin, he thinks life is doing okay, and he comes across this earthling, this trader, this tradesman through the stars in an earthling called Schweitz. And what's rather interesting is that since childhood really, Kinal has had this fixation with earthlings, and he's anything alien, and he sort of really wanted to get to meet this guy. So he sort of plays his political puppet strings to have an opportunity to talk to this Schweitz. Schweitz? I've got to be careful how I pronounce that actually, don't I? What's his name? Schweitz it is. Anyway, so he has this one-on-one meeting with Schweitz, and it sort of gets Kinal into a position where he starts sharing more than he normally would do with a person of Sala or of his homeworld. And that's because the earthlings are like us. They're more than happy referring to themselves as I or me, and sharing their soul with individuals. So this sort of allows Kinal to put his guard down, and he soon learns from Schweitz's own journey. He's trying to find God in many ways and trying to understand the meaning of life, and he has an interest in what's happening with Kinal and his religious beliefs. And he comes across this subject of this drug in the far untamed wilderness that is the South in this novel, where there's this talk of a drug that opens up your mind and allows you to have deeper connections. So initially Schweitz, he's all for this because he wants that spiritual breakthrough. Kinal is sort of tentative. He has a whole lot of issues with following his covenant. And he's really neglectful. But what makes things difficult for him is that during this covenant, the only real relief that these people have is through a bond brother or bond sister. And these individuals are people that you can sort of dump your emotional baggage onto, right? So you can sort of have that connection with these people. But having any more of that soul, bond brother or bond sister relationship, i.e. any physical relationship or love, it's just forbidden in the covenant, right? So you can't, and unfortunately for Kinal, he just loves his bond sister in the true sense of the word, but he knows it's forbidden, and he just does not want to get outside of his covenant, which sort of tempts him into having a look at what the capabilities of these drugs are. So what's there to like about Robert Silverberg's A Time of Changes? Look, for me, one thing that really stood out for me in this particular one is, as always, Robert Silverberg's writing. I'm a big fan of Robert Silverberg, and I really like the narration that he's got going on in this novel because it's written in a first-person account. He's retelling the story. It's almost autobiographical as to how and why he got into this position and what led him to that. So I really enjoyed that. But there's just something interesting about Robert Silverberg that evokes a certain feeling in me that no other author has ever done before. It's sort of a strange, dark, moody feeling that I always get when I read Robert Silverberg. And the book that did that for me the most would be A Tower of Glass, if you read that novel. If you read it and it evokes any kind of feelings in you, they're similar. I get echoes of that in A Time of Changes as well. It's very unique. I wish I could put it into words exactly what it is that's going on inside of me when I read Robert Silverberg. But needless to say, it has that effect on me, and I really enjoyed that. So the other thing I enjoyed was the concept, right? I've mentioned in the past that I like it when books blend that religious and science fiction themes together and sort of expose some hidden truths, right? And I sort of enjoyed that in A Time of Changes as well. I like this concept of, you referring to yourself as I or me, and really having an intimate relationship with someone as being a self-bearer. I enjoyed that concept. It's not new. It has been done in the past, but not necessarily in science fiction. But I like the way that Robert Silverberg attacked that theme here, which I thought was interesting as well. One thing that really stood out for me, this book was written in 1971, and in many ways it really is a reflection of that whole drug culture that happened during the hippie revolution. I couldn't help but really put a lot of I see a lot of similarities as to what was happening here with that whole free love movement and the hippie era. And I think that, Silverberg must have been highly influenced by that, because it definitely comes across at least that way in the novel, which sort of lends itself to what are the things that I didn't like in this novel. So what is there not to like in Robert Silverberg's A Time of Changes? Look, I am a big fan of Robert Silverberg, but I've got to say, in the 60s and 70s, he was a very prolific writer, right, Robert Silverberg. He wrote so many novels, and so many of them were absolutely great. But he also wrote under an alias. I think it was Dave Elliott, and correct me if I'm wrong down below. I'm pretty sure it was Dave Elliott. But he wrote something like 200 pornographic or erotic novels, right? And I don't know, he must have been in that phase, because there's some pretty cheap pornography in this novel, and there's a fixation on Kinno's performance in the bedroom, let's say, that I just thought was a bit tacky. I just don't know. Occasionally it happens with Robert Silverberg novels, and it happens in this one, which I think was a bit too much for me at times. I just thought I don't really understand what this adds to the narrative, and I just thought it was a bit cheap, and I think it would have been a much better novel if it wasn't for some of those sections in the novel. The other thing I would have to say is that the plot in this one was a bit weak when I rate it against other great Robert Silverberg novels. I mean, the plot was really, you have this basic concept where, there's this religious covenant sort of religion that prohibits the use of I, me, and self-bearing, right? So you have that plot, and you have this guy who goes on some kind of journey, some kind of character arc in discovering himself and what it really means to be human in many ways. And with that reference of the drug culture, but that's pretty much the plot, right? It's just not much there when it comes to plot, which also means that there's not a whole lot of science fiction or fantasy for that matter in this novel. And one of the things I love about Robert Silverberg is his imagination when it comes to science fiction. And this one really hasn't really got a whole lot of science fiction or fantasy that really held my attention, that I think may affect it a bit when we get to the sci-fi shed ladder. So when it comes to the memory test, I'd have to say that this, as much as it pains me to say, is not one of Robert Silverberg's most memorable novels. It's not that it's a bad novel. I did enjoy the novel, and it's a good read, and it's a fun, quick read at that. But I just don't think it was as good as some of the other novels that preceded it. And I can't help but think that the Nebula Awards, he won the Nebula Award for this particular novel because they wanted to reward his track record more than they wanted to reward this particular novel. Because some of the novels that were nominated and were finalists in the previous years include novels like A Tower of Glass, one of my all-time favourite novels, Up the Line, which I've mentioned a few times on this channel, which again I thought were just brilliant. The Masks of Time, Thorns, right? These were all finalists that didn't win against some pretty big authors of the genre, giants of the genre in those preceding years. But I can't help but think that he won this novel as a reward for all the wonderful novels that he'd written to date. So when it comes to recommendations then, can I still recommend Robert Silverberg, A Time of Changes? I'd say, look, 100% yes. He is one of my all-time favourite novels, and I really did enjoy this, and I think it's a worthy Nebula Award winning novel. But there are, I believe, stronger works by Robert Silverberg that did deserve a Nebula Award and or a Hugo Award. And I'd have to say that this novel sort of reminds me of Philip K. Dick. When we reviewed his novel, what was it? When we reviewed Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, right? I can't help that Silverberg and Philip K. Dick share a similar kind of fate when it comes to the Hugo and Nebula Awards. They both won a Hugo, PKD won a Hugo and Silverberg won the Nebula. But I've got to say that they were not their best works, and I can't help but relate back to PKD when I see this novel. So when it comes to recommendations, look, I still highly recommend Robert Silverberg. Any one of his novels is a great read, and this is no exception. So I'd say don't be, I guess, put off by what I've just said. This is just coming from someone who's read a whole lot of Robert Silverberg, and there are many books that I will rank above this one, but this is still in itself a very good novel. So if you've enjoyed books like Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, I think you will also enjoy A Time of Changes by Robert Silverberg, because it sort of does cover similar themes, where Ursula, I think, was a better written novel. It was a bit more of an interesting concept. It still shared that concept around, she was more dealing with the identity of gender, right, male and female, and what that would look like. So it sort of covers similar themes. I think if you enjoyed Left Hand of Darkness, I think you will like Robert Silverberg's A Time of Changes. The other one that comes to mind is Robert Heinlein's A Stranger in a Strange Land, because that also covers similar themes, like with this messianic figure here and the use of drug and free love and all of that. So I think if you've enjoyed Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land, I think you'll find A Time of Changes is an interesting read and somewhat less controversial than what we found in Robert Heinlein's. But if I've got to make some recommendations when it comes to Silverberg, I'd say have a look at something like Tower of Glass. If you have read A Time of Changes, then I say have a go at A Tower of Glass. This is one of my favourite Robert Silverberg novels, and it's sort of like I alluded to in my review. I got similar feelings reading this as I did Time of Changes. So I think have a go. Tower of Glass, an absolute classic. I need to reread this and review it for you one of these days. And the other one that comes to mind as well is Robert Silverberg's A Man in a Maze. This one was a rather interesting novel with, again, this individual, the main protagonist in the book, was on another self-imposed exile because he was having some real difficult problems relating to other people, and I'll leave it at that for this particular bit. But I think there were similarities I saw in A Man in the Maze to what we saw in A Time of Changes. So that was it. We've got to rank it on the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder. It's going to be an interesting one, but let's flip the cameras around and see exactly where we land tonight. So back to the Shed Ladder and ranking tonight's 1971 Nebula Award-winning novel by one of my all-time favourite authors. Is that going to be enough to have this sitting on the A side of the board? And when I think about my criteria, which I've documented down below, I don't think it warrants its place on the top side of the board. And mainly it's to do with that concept. I just don't think there was enough science fiction in it for it to warrant its place among some of the greatest concepts in science fiction that we have on the board so far on that A side. I thought the execution was okay, but also lost a couple of points when it comes to the plot. I thought the plot was pretty simplistic. There wasn't really a whole lot that was going on. The characters were not very memorable. I'd say they were quite forgettable, honestly. And overall, it didn't fare too well when it comes to the memory test, because there wasn't really much I could recall of this one, even though it is by one of my all-time favourite authors. So when we look at the seaside, there's still some great, absolute fantastic novels on this list. Books like Babel 17 and Man Plus. I mean, how good was Man Plus? Books like Double Star by Heinlein, Nettle and Bone, which we've just recently reviewed, A Quantum Rose, The Einstein Intersection, right? The Big Time, Fritz Leiber. I mean, there's so many great novels. So I don't think it's a bad place to be on our Sci-Fi Shed, because I've said it before and I'll say it again, these are all great novels, and I'm a huge fan of Robert Silverberg, so I think this is still definitely a very great novel and a raw and true Nebula winner. So is it going to be better than The Falling Woman? I think it is. I mean, The Falling Woman fell into that category where I just really couldn't classify it as fantasy. So it lost quite a few marks when it comes to the concept and the execution of it. So I'm going to have to say that it is definitely better than Pat Murphy's The Falling Woman. The Quantum Rose was an interesting book again. It had an interesting concept, very interesting concept when it comes to that quantum physics and relating it to sort of a Beauty and the Beast type story. But it's not a very memorable novel, and I don't think the writing was as good as what we see in Robert Silverberg. It definitely didn't evoke those feelings that just no one but Silverberg does for me. When we look at books like A Memory Called Empire and A Serial Justice, I always like to talk to those two novels together because they're very similar as far as the concepts and execution of those concepts. Both had very, very strong concepts, and they were interesting reads, but they were not necessarily memorable, and that's the main gripe that I had with those two novels. But is Robert Silverberg's A Time of Changes going to be better than that duo, the powerhouse of Arkady Martine and Ann Leckie? And I'm going to have to say, as much as it pains me, I don't think there's enough of a science fiction concept in this otherwise really wonderful novel to warrant its place above A Memory Called Empire and Ancillary Justice. So tonight we're going to stick Robert Silverberg's great novel just below those two. Actually, where did I stick it? Sorry, wrong spot. Just below those two, which I think is a very well earned place and a great novel to boot. Have you read any Robert Silverberg novels? Would you agree with me if you have? Is this one of his better ones? I don't think it is. Like I said, I'm sort of surprised that this one won a Nebula over some of his other work, which I think is just awesome. Some great novels in there. But that's where we have it today. Do you feel it should have been higher, lower? I'd love to hear your thoughts as always. Until next time, I'm still reading some pretty interesting novels for your review, so hopefully you can hit that notification bell and subscribe and you won't miss out. I'll see you next time in the shed.